The moment they laugh at your tears is often the moment they stop paying attention to what you're about to become. My name is Ethan Walker, and if you had walked into the Ashford Grand Hotel that Christmas Eve, you probably would have believed I was the saddest man in the ballroom. Maybe you would have pitied me. Maybe you would have looked away out of respect. Or maybe, like everyone else wearing designer suits beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers and sparkling Christmas lights, you would have laughed with the rest of them. The orchestra played soft holiday classics while waiters floated across polished marble floors carrying silver trays filled with champagne. A 20-foot Christmas tree stood in the center of the ballroom wrapped in white lights and gold ribbons, beautiful enough to belong on a postcard. Families smiled for pictures. Children chased each other between decorated tables. Somewhere nearby, someone joked about how Christmas miracles still happened. I remember thinking they were right. Miracles do happen. They just rarely arrive the way people expect. My wife, Olivia Walker, stood only a few feet away from me in a dark emerald evening dress that matched the decorations almost perfectly. She looked elegant, confident, completely at ease. If anyone had asked, they would have said we were the perfect couple celebrating another successful year together. They would have been wrong. Olivia cleared her throat and gently tapped a spoon against her champagne glass. The room slowly quieted until every conversation faded into silence. More than 60 members of her family turned toward us with warm smiles, expecting another holiday toast. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a large manila envelope. Even before she spoke, I knew exactly what was inside. "Ethan," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "I think Christmas is the perfect time for new beginnings." A few relatives laughed politely, assuming she was about to announce a vacation or a new business venture. She removed several sheets of paper and extended them toward me. "These are divorce papers." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then someone at the back of the room chuckled. Another person whispered something that made an entire table laugh. My father-in-law leaned back in his chair with crossed arms, as though he had been waiting for this moment for years. Olivia's younger brother actually clapped once before raising his wine glass. "Go ahead," he called out. "Sign them. Save everybody the drama." More laughter followed. It echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling until it blended with the Christmas music still drifting through the speakers. I lowered my eyes toward the papers. 20 years of marriage had somehow been reduced to neat paragraphs, signature lines, and legal language printed on bright white pages. My hands trembled as I accepted the folder. Someone behind me muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "He'll probably beg first." Another voice answered, "He's got nowhere else to go." More laughter. I wish I could tell you I stood taller. I wish I could tell you I delivered some unforgettable speech that silenced every person in that ballroom. The truth is far less dramatic. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. I didn't wipe it away. I simply stared at my own name printed above the signature line, while the ink pen felt heavier than anything I had ever held. Across the room, Olivia folded her arms with quiet confidence. She already believed she knew exactly how this story ended. Her parents believed it too. Her cousins smiled at one another. Her uncle pulled out his phone, pretending to check a message while secretly waiting to watch me fall apart. They all expected anger. They expected pleading. They expected humiliation. What they never expected was acceptance. I uncapped the pen. The room became strangely quiet again. Even the laughter faded as everyone leaned forward to watch. My breathing slowed. My heartbeat steadied. I signed my name carefully, one letter at a time, until the final stroke crossed the page. Ethan Walker. 20 years reduced to 8 letters and a signature. I placed the pen gently on top of the papers and slid them back toward Olivia without saying a single word. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then applause erupted across the ballroom. My brother-in-law laughed so hard. He nearly spilled his drink. Someone shouted, "Best Christmas present ever." Olivia smiled with visible relief, almost surprised that I hadn't made things difficult. She picked up the papers as though she had just won something valuable. I looked around the ballroom one last time. Faces I had spent decades trying to earn acceptance from now looked at me with open amusement. Every smile carried the same message. They believed they had watched a broken man surrender. They believed they had witnessed the end of my story. I reached for my winter coat resting over the back of my chair, slipped it on without rushing, and quietly adjusted the collar. My eyes drifted toward the enormous Christmas tree glowing in the center of the room. Beautiful lights. Beautiful decorations. Beautiful illusions. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because something inside me had finally become unbelievably calm. I looked directly at Olivia for the last time that evening. "Merry Christmas," I said softly. Then I turned toward the ballroom entrance. Behind me, laughter started again, louder than before. None of them noticed the black SUV pulling beneath the hotel entrance outside. None of them noticed the man in a tailored charcoal overcoat stepping out before the vehicle had fully stopped. And none of them had the slightest idea why he was already walking toward the front doors with only one sentence prepared. "Good evening, Chairman Walker." Ethan Walker. The words echoed through the quiet entrance before I even reached the revolving doors. I stopped for the briefest moment, my hand still resting against the brass handle as snow drifted gently outside beneath the glow of the hotel lights. Behind me, laughter continued spilling from the ballroom, muffled now by thick wooden doors and expensive holiday decorations. In front of me stood a man I had known for nearly 12 years. Daniel Brooks wore a charcoal overcoat over a tailored navy suit, his silver hair dusted lightly with snowflakes that had not yet melted. He gave me a respectful nod before opening the rear passenger door of the black sport utility vehicle waiting beneath the covered entrance. "Good evening, Chairman Walker," he repeated with the calm professionalism that had never changed. I offered him a faint smile. "Good evening, Daniel." He glanced toward the ballroom windows where silhouettes moved behind elegant curtains. "Everything went as expected?" he asked quietly. I looked back once. Through the glass, I could still see people raising glasses, embracing one another, celebrating what they believed was the end of a disappointing marriage. They had no idea that my signature had never been the end of anything. It had simply closed one chapter one had been trying to leave behind for years. "Yes," I answered. "Everything happened exactly the way it needed to." Daniel opened the vehicle door wider. "The board members have arrived. They are waiting for you downtown." I nodded, but did not climb inside immediately. Instead, I slipped one hand into my coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph that had been folded enough times for the edges to soften. Olivia and I stood together in front of a tiny brick apartment 20 years earlier. Neither of us owned much more than a second-hand sedan and two folding lawn chairs we used as living room furniture. We looked exhausted, hopeful, and completely certain that love alone could build a future. I remembered carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs because we could not afford movers. I remembered eating frozen dinners on the floor because we had not purchased a dining table yet. I remembered Olivia laughing every time the apartment heater rattled loud enough to wake the neighbors. Back then she used to squeeze my hand and tell me, "One day we will laugh about all of this." She had been right. We were laughing now, just not together. I slipped the photograph back into my pocket before climbing into the warm leather interior of the vehicle. The door closed softly behind me, shutting out the cold December air. Daniel settled into the driver's seat while the city lights reflected across the windshield. "Would you like to go directly to the office?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "There is no reason to keep them waiting." The vehicle eased away from the hotel without drawing attention. Inside the ballroom, no one noticed. Why would they? To them, I was simply the unemployed husband who had quietly accepted divorce papers instead of arguing. They never wondered how a man with no visible career always managed to remain calm during every financial crisis. They never questioned why mortgage payments always cleared on time, even when Olivia's investment struggled. They assumed stability simply happened. They never asked who quietly solved problems before anyone else even realized they existed. I preferred it that way. Recognition has a strange cost. The moment people know what you possess, many stop seeing who you are. I learned that lesson long before I married Olivia. The city skyline slowly appeared ahead as Christmas lights decorated office towers and storefronts across downtown. Families walked beneath glowing wreaths carrying shopping bags and hot coffee, while church bells rang somewhere in the distance. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday because it reminded me that hope often arrives during the coldest season. Tonight, that feeling returned, although in a completely different form. Daniel finally broke the silence again. "The acquisition documents were finalized this afternoon," he said. "Every signature has been verified. Effective midnight, Walker Capital officially assumes controlling interest." I closed my eyes for a brief second. 12 years of planning. 5 years of negotiations. Hundreds of quiet meetings that no one outside a small circle would ever know had taken place. All of it became official while my former family celebrated what they believed was my greatest defeat. There was an odd kind of peace in that timing. Have they been notified? I asked. Daniel smiled slightly. Not yet. The notices are scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, including the executive leadership team. I looked out the window again as snow continued falling across the sleeping city. Somewhere behind us, Olivia was probably accepting congratulations. Her parents were probably raising another toast. Her brother was almost certainly repeating jokes about the man who signed away his marriage without a fight. I did not resent them anymore. Resentment is heavy, and I had carried enough weight for one lifetime. What interested me now was not revenge. It was truth. Because by tomorrow morning, every assumption they had built over 20 years would begin collapsing under one simple fact. The man they believed had walked away with nothing had never been the powerless husband they imagined. And before the next Christmas song finished playing inside that ballroom, the future they thought belonged entirely to them had already begun quietly changing hands. The headquarters of Walker Capital occupied the top 20 floors of a glass tower overlooking the river, but very few people knew my name was attached to the building. That had always been intentional. Wealth attracts attention. Power attracts expectations. Silence attracts the truth. By the time our vehicle entered the underground garage, the city had settled into the peaceful rhythm that only Christmas Eve could bring. Most offices were dark. Most employees were home with their families. Ours was one of the few buildings still glowing against the winter sky. Daniel held the elevator as I stepped inside. Neither of us spoke during the ride to the executive floor. We had shared too many nights like this over the years to waste words. When the doors opened, the boardroom was already illuminated. 11 men and women rose from their seats the moment I entered. Some had gray hair earned through decades of business. Others were younger, brilliant analysts who had helped build Walker Capital into one of the most respected private investment firms in the country. They were not standing because I demanded it. They stood because respect cannot be purchased. It has to be earned one quiet decision at a time. Good evening, Mr. Walker, several voices said almost in unison. I returned the greeting before taking my seat at the head of the long walnut conference table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow drifted slowly over the skyline, while Christmas lights reflected across the river below. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Margaret Shun, our chief legal officer, slid a thick folder across the polished table. Everything is complete, she said. The controlling interest officially transferred at 11:38 tonight. Regulatory filings have been accepted. Notification letters are scheduled for distribution at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I opened the folder without rushing. Inside were documents representing years of negotiations, strategic acquisitions, and patient planning. Every page had been reviewed more times than I could count. Every signature had been verified. There would be no surprises. The only surprise belonged to the people who believed they understood the company they were running. Across the table, David Reynolds adjusted his glasses before speaking. The executive leadership at Ashford Consumer Holdings still believes the minority shareholders control the board. They have no indication that Walker Capital now owns 54%. I nodded. Keep it that way until the notices are delivered. David smiled. They will not see it coming. Those words lingered in the room longer than anyone intended. They described much more than a business transaction. They described 20 years of my marriage. Olivia had always believed I lacked ambition because I never chased recognition. Her parents believed success had to be loud enough for neighbors to admire. Expensive cars, country club memberships, magazine interviews, charity galas. They measured achievement by visibility. I measured it by stability. If the people I cared about slept peacefully at night, I considered that success. Somewhere along the way, they stopped noticing the quiet man who made that peace possible. Margaret looked toward me with careful curiosity. If I may ask something personal? I gave a small nod. Of course. Tonight must have been difficult. A faint smile crossed my face. Difficult was not the word I would have chosen. Painful, perhaps. Necessary, certainly. But not difficult. Difficult decisions are the ones you avoid because you cannot see the right path. Tonight, I had known exactly what needed to happen. I buried that marriage long before the paperwork was signed. I answered softly. The signature simply made it official. No one offered sympathy. They knew I did not want it. Instead, Daniel placed a small envelope beside my folder. This arrived. Earlier today, he said. Your father requested that it be delivered personally. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father had passed away 3 years earlier, but before his death he had arranged for several letters to be released on important milestones in my life. My fingers rested on the envelope for a moment before opening it. The note inside was only a few lines long. Ethan, if you are reading this, it means another season of your life has ended. Remember what I taught you when we repaired old fences together. Strong men do not measure themselves by who walks away. They measure themselves by the promises they keep after everyone else stops believing in them. Build quietly. Forgive when you can. Leave with dignity when you must. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my inside coat pocket. For the first time that evening, I felt something warmer than relief. I felt gratitude. My father had never met the people sitting around this table, yet somehow he had prepared me for every conversation I would ever have. David cleared his throat again. There is one final item. He pressed a button on the remote, and a presentation appeared on the large screen. The company logo of Ashford Consumer Holdings filled the display. Beneath it appeared the names of every executive, every board member, and every department head. Near the center of the chart was a familiar name. Olivia Walker, Executive Vice President of Corporate Strategy. I studied the screen without emotion. Tomorrow morning, she would arrive at work believing she still understood the future. She would greet coworkers, answer emails, perhaps even tell someone about the divorce she celebrated at Christmas dinner. Then, precisely at 8 o'clock, every executive in that building would receive the same confidential notice announcing that control of the company had changed overnight. And for the first time in 20 years, Olivia would discover that the quiet man everyone underestimated had never truly left the board. He had simply been sitting at a much larger table all along. Christmas morning arrived wrapped in fresh snow and remarkable silence. At 6:30, I was already awake, standing beside the windows of my apartment overlooking the river as the first hints of sunrise painted the skyline with pale shades of gold and blue. For the first time in many years, I did not wonder whether Olivia had slept well or whether her family had enjoyed the holiday gathering after I left. Those questions belonged to another version of me. I poured a cup of black coffee and watched the city slowly come alive. Somewhere across town, children were opening presents while families gathered around breakfast tables. Somewhere else, church bells welcomed early worshipers into warm sanctuaries filled with candles and familiar hymns. It occurred to me that life never pauses for heartbreak. The world continues moving, asking each of us to decide whether we will move with it or remain trapped inside yesterday. At exactly 7:45, Daniel arrived carrying 2 folders and a tablet computer. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," he said. "Everything is on schedule." I invited him inside, and we reviewed the final sequence one last time. At 8 o'clock sharp, encrypted notices would be delivered simultaneously to every member of the executive leadership team at Ashford Consumer Holdings. The announcement was straightforward. Walker Capital had legally completed its acquisition of a controlling interest. A special board meeting would begin at 10 o'clock. Attendance was mandatory. No exceptions. There was nothing dramatic about the wording. Business rarely needed dramatic language. Facts were usually powerful enough. Daniel looked up from the tablet. "Do you expect resistance?" I smiled faintly. "I expect surprise. Resistance comes later." At 7:59, the room became unusually quiet. Neither of us spoke. The digital clock on the wall changed to 8 o'clock exactly. Daniel touched the screen once. Hundreds of secure messages began traveling across servers in less than a second. Years of preparation disappeared into the invisible speed of modern technology. Somewhere downtown, phones vibrated almost simultaneously. Computer screens lit up. Executives reaching for their morning coffee suddenly found themselves reading the same unexpected announcement. I imagined Olivia sitting in her corner office overlooking the financial district, probably wearing one of her tailored business suits, confident that the new year would bring promotions and larger responsibilities. She always arrived early because she believed successful people should be seen before everyone else. She valued appearances. I valued results. Those two philosophies had quietly drifted apart long before our marriage ended. Daniel's tablet chimed softly. "The first confirmations are coming in," he said. He rotated the screen toward me. Read receipts continued appearing one after another. Chief Financial Officer, General Counsel, Human Resources Director, Board Secretary. Executive Vice President of Corporate Strategy, Olivia Walker. She had opened the message only 34 seconds after delivery. I stared at her name without saying anything. I wondered what expression had crossed her face when she read the words. Confusion? Disbelief? Curiosity? She knew every major shareholder. At least she believed she did. Walker Capital had always remained intentionally distant, represented through attorneys and financial advisors instead of public appearances. She had probably never imagined the firm's founder had been sitting across the dinner table from her almost every evening for 2 decades. Daniel's phone rang. He listened briefly before ending the call. The board secretary reports considerable confusion. Several executives are requesting clarification before the meeting. They will receive clarification at 10, I replied. Not before. Another message appeared, this time from Margaret Chen. The emergency meeting room was fully prepared. Outside legal counsel had arrived. Independent auditors were present. Every required document had been verified twice. There would be no procedural mistakes. I appreciated that more than anyone realized. My father used to say that character reveals itself most clearly when you have every opportunity to embarrass someone and choose professionalism instead. I intended to honor that lesson. This was never about humiliation. It was about accountability. Around 9:15, Daniel looked out the apartment window before speaking quietly. Would you like to know something interesting? Go ahead. Several news outlets have already noticed unusual trading activity surrounding Ashford Consumer Holdings. Reporters are beginning to ask questions. I nodded slowly. Then today will be longer than anyone expected. I walked toward the bedroom and selected a navy suit with a simple silver tie. Nothing expensive enough to attract attention. Nothing flashy enough to suggest celebration. Victories built on another person's pain should never be worn like trophies. As I adjusted my cuff links, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back appeared older than the husband who had entered that Christmas party the previous evening. Not because a single night had changed him, but because one final illusion had finally disappeared. My telephone vibrated across the dresser. The screen displayed a name I had not expected to see so soon. Olivia Walker. I watched it ring without reaching for it. It stopped. 2 seconds later it started again. Then a third time. Daniel looked toward me from the living room, but did not ask what I intended to do. He already knew. Some conversations become meaningful only after people are ready to hear the truth. And judging by the urgency of those repeated calls, Olivia had just begun asking questions that no one inside her office could answer. The telephone finally stopped ringing, leaving an almost peaceful silence inside the apartment. I placed the device back on the kitchen counter and finished the last sip of coffee that had already gone cold. Daniel watched me for a moment before gathering the folders we would need for the meeting. She will keep calling, he said. I know, I answered. But she does not need my voice right now. She needs the truth. At 9:45, we entered the lobby of Walker Capital. The holiday decorations were elegant but understated. Evergreen garlands wrapped around polished railings, white lights reflecting softly against marble floors, and a towering Christmas tree standing quietly near the reception desk. Employees who had volunteered to work during the holiday greeted me with warm smiles rather than nervous formality. Every one of them had families waiting at home, yet they had chosen to be there because today's meeting represented years of work for all of us. Merry Christmas, Mr. Walker, the receptionist said. Merry Christmas, Emily, I replied. Thank you for being here. She smiled. This seemed important. It is, I said, and I appreciate your time. We continued toward the executive conference floor. Unlike the celebration at the hotel the night before, this building carried a different kind of energy. There were no raised voices, no applause, no mocking laughter. Only quiet professionalism. I had spent years building a company where respect mattered more than titles. My father believed that people reveal their character in ordinary moments, not extraordinary ones. Watching employees hold doors open for one another and thank the maintenance staff reminded me that he had been right. As we approached the boardroom, Margaret Chen stepped into the hallway carrying a folder filled with updated reports. Everything is ready, she said. The representatives from Ashford Consumer Holdings have confirmed their attendance. Several arrived much earlier than expected. How are they handling the news? I asked. Margaret gave a thoughtful smile. Confused. Concerned. They have been asking the same question repeatedly. Which question? Who exactly is Ethan Walker? I looked toward the closed boardroom doors for a long moment before answering. They are about to find out. Daniel handed me a tablet displaying the latest market information. Ashford Consumer Holdings had not yet experienced major movement because the acquisition remained confidential until the board meeting concluded. Investors sensed that something unusual was happening, but facts had not yet replaced speculation. Markets often behaved like people. They reacted emotionally before understanding the whole story. At 9:58, another message appeared on my telephone. This time it was not a missed call. It was a text from Olivia. Ethan, please answer me. Someone says Walker Capital owns the company now. They are saying your name in the conference room. Tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. I read the message twice before locking the screen again. Daniel studied my expression carefully. Will you respond? He asked. I slipped the phone into my pocket. Not by text. He nodded once, understanding immediately. Some conversations deserve eye contact. Some truths deserve silence until the right room and the right moment. At exactly 10 o'clock, the conference room doors opened. Directors from Walker Capital entered first, taking their seats with calm confidence. Moments later, the representatives from Ashford Consumer Holdings walked inside. I recognized nearly every face from annual reports and shareholder presentations. Then Olivia entered. She stopped only briefly after seeing me seated at the head of the long conference table. It was not dramatic. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But after 20 years of marriage, I recognized every expression she tried to hide. Surprise, confusion, disbelief. She looked from me to the company logo displayed on the presentation screen, and then toward Margaret, who was organizing legal documents beside my chair. Her father was not with her. Neither was her brother. This was not a family gathering where laughter could drown out uncomfortable facts. This was a board meeting governed by corporate law and documented procedures. Olivia slowly took her assigned seat across from me, without saying a word. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances, clearly trying to understand why the quiet husband they had occasionally met at holiday dinners now occupied the chairman's position. One man leaned toward another and whispered something I could not hear. Margaret closed the conference room doors before speaking in her usual calm voice. Good morning, everyone. This special session has been called following the completion of a controlling equity acquisition by Walker Capital. Today's agenda includes confirmation of ownership, board restructuring, executive review, and strategic planning for the upcoming fiscal year. The room remained perfectly still. Then Margaret turned toward me with complete professionalism. Mr. Chairman, the meeting is yours. For several seconds, I simply looked around the table. Some faces appeared anxious. Others seemed skeptical. Olivia never looked away from me. The confidence she had carried the previous evening was gone, replaced by questions that no one else in the room could answer. I folded my hands on the polished table and spoke in the same calm voice I had used when signing the divorce papers only hours earlier. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ethan Walker, and I believe we have a great deal to discuss. SUA, the room remained perfectly silent after my introduction. No one reached for a notebook. No one whispered another question. Even the quiet hum of the heating system seemed louder than the breathing around the conference table. I looked at each executive before continuing, not with anger, but with the same patience that had guided every major decision I had made over the past 2 decades. First, I said calmly, I want to thank every employee who helped build this company. Acquisitions do not happen because of one individual. They happen because thousands of people show up every morning and choose excellence. Several executives relaxed slightly. They had expected confrontation. Instead, they were hearing gratitude. Margaret distributed updated ownership reports around the table while I continued. Walker Capital now holds a controlling interest of 54%. Every transaction has been independently reviewed. Every regulatory requirement has been satisfied, and every filing has been accepted under federal and state law. Today's meeting is not about debating whether this acquisition happened. It is about deciding what happens next. Across the table, Olivia finally spoke. Her voice remained composed, but I recognized the effort behind it. Ethan, she said carefully, why did you never tell me? Every pair of eyes turned toward me. It was a simple question, but the answer carried 20 years of history. I folded my hands together before replying. I tried to tell you who I was many times. You simply believed my value depended on a job title you could explain at dinner parties. The words were quiet, yet they settled over the room with surprising weight. Olivia lowered her eyes for only a second before looking back at me. You let me believe you were struggling. I shook my head gently. No, I let you believe what you had already decided. No one interrupted. Daniel remained standing near the back wall while Margaret prepared the next agenda item. David Reynolds projected financial reports onto the large display. Revenue trends, growth projections, long-term investments. Every chart reflected years of careful planning rather than dramatic risk. Walker Capital has supported Ashford Consumer Holdings indirectly for more than 11 years, I explained. Several difficult periods that appeared to resolve naturally were supported through strategic financing arranged by our firm. We never requested public recognition because the stability of the company mattered more than publicity. One of the independent directors adjusted his glasses. You are saying Walker Capital helped keep this company operating through the recession? Yes. And through the supply chain disruption? Yes. He leaned back slowly, clearly processing the information. None of us knew. That was intentional, I replied. Olivia stared at the financial reports with growing disbelief. I could almost see memories reorganizing themselves inside her mind. Nights when I quietly worked from my study. Weekend meetings I described only as investment reviews. Business trips she assumed were consulting assignments. None of those explanations had been false. They had simply never required further detail because she had never asked another question. Finally, she looked toward me again. Were you testing me? The question carried genuine hurt, but I answered honestly. Never. Marriage is not an examination. I wanted a partner who cared more about character than appearances. For many years, I believed I had one. The room became still once more. There was no satisfaction in saying those words. Only sadness. Margaret broke the silence with practiced professionalism. Moving to the next agenda item. Board restructuring. She displayed a new organization. SUA. The formal meeting concluded shortly before noon, but no one seemed eager to leave the room. The presentation slides had disappeared from the screen, the legal documents had been signed, and every procedural requirement had been completed. Yet the atmosphere remained unusually still, as though everyone understood that the most important part of the morning had never appeared in any agenda. One by one, the directors gathered their folders and quietly thanked me before leaving. There were no dramatic speeches and no celebratory handshakes. Professional people rarely confuse success with spectacle. Within a few minutes, only a handful of us remained inside the boardroom. Margaret excused herself to coordinate with outside counsel. Daniel stepped into the hallway to answer several incoming calls. The heavy conference room doors closed softly, leaving Olivia and me alone for the first time since the Christmas party. She remained seated across from me, her hands resting on the polished walnut table. The confidence that had surrounded her the previous evening had been replaced by something far quieter. She looked exhausted, not because of the long meeting, but because certainty had disappeared overnight. Finally, she spoke. How long? She asked. How long have you owned Walker Capital? I looked toward the snow drifting beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows before answering. I founded it 12 years ago. She stared at me in disbelief. 12 years. I nodded. We had already been married for 8 years by then. She shook her head slowly, struggling to connect the timeline she remembered with the reality now sitting across from her. Every business trip, every late evening, every weekend you said you had investment meetings. They were investment meetings, I replied gently. I never lied to you. She lowered her eyes. You just never told me everything. I thought carefully before responding. There is a difference between hiding something and waiting for someone to ask because they are genuinely interested. Silence settled between us again. I remembered countless evenings when I had returned home hoping to talk about new opportunities, difficult negotiations, or companies we had helped rebuild. Most conversations never reached that point. They usually shifted toward promotions inside her company, social events, expensive vacations her colleagues were taking, or which executive had purchased another lake house. Little by little, I stopped talking about my own work because it seemed unimportant to everyone except me. I used to ask how your day went, Olivia whispered. A faint smile crossed my face, though there was no bitterness behind it. You asked whether it was busy. You rarely asked what mattered to me. She closed her eyes for a moment. I did not realize I was doing that. I know. She looked back at me, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. Last night, when everyone laughed. She stopped before finishing the sentence. I understood what she could not bring herself to say. You did not stop them, I answered calmly. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. I should have. Yes, I said softly. You should have. The honesty between us hurt more than anger ever could. There was no point pretending those moments had not happened. They belonged to our history now, permanent and unchangeable. Olivia folded her hands together. Were you crying because of the divorce? I looked down at the wedding band that had rested on my hand for 2 decades. I had removed it that morning before leaving my apartment, yet I could still feel its familiar weight. No, I admitted. I was grieving the marriage we stopped protecting years ago. She covered her mouth for a brief moment, as though those words had reached somewhere deeper. When the conference room door closed behind Olivia, I remained where I was for several moments, listening to the quiet that settled over the executive floor. It was remarkable how silence could sound completely different depending on the life you had just lived. The silence inside the ballroom the previous evening had been filled with judgment waiting to become laughter. The silence now carried reflection. Daniel stepped back into the room holding a tablet and a neatly organized stack of reports. He studied my expression before speaking. The transition is proceeding exactly as planned. I gave a small nod. Good. He hesitated for a moment. There is one issue you should probably know about. He placed the tablet in front of me. The screen displayed several internal messages exchanged among senior executives at Ashford Consumer Holdings during the previous hour. No confidential conversations had been accessed improperly. These were official communications now belonging to the new ownership structure. Most of the messages centered on uncertainty. Employees wondered whether departments would be reorganized, whether budgets would change, or whether layoffs were coming despite my earlier statement. Then one message caught my attention. It came from Olivia to the executive leadership team. I read it slowly. Please remain professional. We do not have all the facts yet. Until we receive additional direction, continue serving our employees and customers exactly as we always have. Do not spread rumors. I read the message a second time before setting the tablet aside. Daniel looked at me curiously. She handled that well. Yes, I answered honestly. She did. There was no satisfaction in pretending otherwise. Leadership reveals itself most clearly during uncertainty, and despite everything that had happened between us, Olivia had chosen stability instead of panic. That decision deserved acknowledgement. Around noon, Margaret entered carrying the final governance documents. The transition is officially complete, she said. Every filing has been accepted. The board recognizes you as permanent chairman. I signed the last page and returned the folder. Thank you, Margaret. She smiled warmly. You know, most people spend years preparing for a moment like this and celebrate afterward. I glanced toward the snow-covered skyline. I celebrated years ago. She raised an eyebrow. When? The day I realized success is measured by what you quietly build, not by what strangers applaud. She laughed softly before excusing herself. After everyone had left, I walked alone through the executive floor. Most offices were empty because of the holiday. Family photographs rested on desks beside coffee mugs, children's drawings hung on bulletin boards, and small Christmas decorations brightened otherwise ordinary workspaces. Companies are often described through numbers, but numbers never tell the whole story. Behind every spreadsheet stands someone hoping to provide a better life for the people waiting at home. That was the reason I had built Walker Capital the way I had. Investments mattered. People mattered more. My telephone vibrated again. This time the caller was not Olivia. It was her father, Richard Bennett. I watched his name appear on the screen before answering. Hello, Richard. The line remained silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded far less certain than it had during the Christmas party. Ethan, I think we should talk. I leaned against the window, overlooking the river. About what? Another pause. There are things we did not understand. I remembered the laughter echoing across the ballroom, the applause after I signed the divorce papers, and the satisfaction on his face as he watched his daughter end a 20-year marriage. Yet strangely, I felt no desire to remind him of any of it. Carrying resentment into every conversation only guarantees that yesterday continues controlling tomorrow. Perhaps, I replied calmly. But today is Christmas. Spend it with your family. His breathing became noticeably heavier. After everything that happened, you are still telling me to spend time with my family? I smiled faintly. That is exactly what Christmas is for. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke again, his voice had softened. I owe you an apology. I looked at the falling snow outside the window. Apologies matter when they are followed by change. Do you think that is still possible? He asked quietly. I thought about the question much longer than he probably expected. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. One frees the heart. The other requires rebuilding trust one decision at a time. People can change, I said at last. Whether they choose to is something only they can decide. After ending the call, I slipped my coat on and headed toward the elevator. The workday was finished. There would always be more meetings, more reports, more acquisitions, and more responsibilities waiting after the holidays. But some promises deserved equal attention. Every Christmas afternoon for the past 15 years I had volunteered at a neighborhood community center founded by my late father, helping serve warm meals and deliver gifts donated by local businesses. I had never missed a single year, not even when business demanded impossible schedules. Daniel looked surprised when he saw me heading toward the exit instead of my office. Where are you going? He asked. I smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in days. To keep a promise. As the elevator doors closed, I realized something unexpected. The greatest victory of the past 24 hours was not becoming chairman of a company or watching hidden truths finally come to light. It was discovering that despite every disappointment, I had not allowed another person's opinion to change the kind of man I wanted to be. 1 year passed more quietly than I ever imagined it would. Time has a strange way of correcting perspectives that emotions cannot. The newspapers eventually stopped writing about the acquisition. Financial analysts moved on to newer stories. The markets found their balance again. Even the conversations inside boardrooms shifted from surprise to ordinary business. Life, as it always does, continued moving forward. The first Christmas after the divorce arrived beneath another blanket of fresh snow. I found myself standing outside the same neighborhood community center my father had built decades earlier. Children raced across the parking lot wearing oversized winter coats, while volunteers carried boxes of donated toys and warm meals through the front doors. Inside, the smell of cinnamon, coffee, and fresh-baked cookies filled every hallway. Someone had placed a simple evergreen tree in the corner of the main room, decorated with handmade ornaments crafted by local families. It was not nearly as grand as the towering tree inside the luxury hotel ballroom from the year before, yet somehow it felt infinitely more beautiful. Daniel walked over carrying 2 large boxes filled with wrapped gifts. You were right, he said with a smile. This is a much better way to spend Christmas. I laughed softly before taking one of the boxes from his hands. My father used to say that generosity is the only investment that always pays dividends. Throughout the afternoon, I helped serve meals, listened to children explain what they hoped to become when they grew up, and watched exhausted parents smile with the quiet relief that comes from knowing someone cared enough to show up. No cameras, no speeches, no applause. Just ordinary people choosing kindness during the coldest season of the year. As the afternoon came to an end, my telephone vibrated gently inside my coat pocket. The message displayed only a short sentence. Merry Christmas, Ethan. Thank you for teaching me that respect matters more than appearances. I hope one day I become someone worthy of the lessons I ignored. Olivia. I read the message once before locking the screen again. There was no anger left inside me. There was no satisfaction either. Only acceptance. Some stories end because 2 people stop loving each other. Ours ended because somewhere along the way we stopped truly seeing each other. That realization had taken me much longer to understand than any business strategy ever had. Daniel noticed the thoughtful expression on my face, but never asked about the message. He simply handed me another box that needed carrying. Still working? He joked. Always, I replied with a smile. As evenings settled over the city, volunteers gathered outside beneath strings of white lights, while fresh snow drifted quietly across the parking lot. Children waved goodbye from car windows. Families drove home together. The community center slowly became quiet again. Before leaving, I stepped back inside one last time to switch off the lights surrounding the Christmas tree. Only the small white bulbs remained glowing softly in the empty room. I stood there remembering another Christmas exactly 1 year